How's it going, everyone? This week we are finally jumping into the Whelan book head first. So we're going over chapters 1 through 3, and I want to reiterate what I mentioned in the intro to the course. This textbook is a lot heavier than the first one. The first one read much more like a regular textbook, kind of give you the nuts and bolts about research. This one, as you can tell, is a statistics book. But there's a reason why I chose this book is because it provides a number of explanations of statistics that I think are going to be necessary for you when you're in a leadership position. But more importantly, it provides a number of examples in trying to get you to understand what these numbers and facts and what these terms really actually truly mean. So that being said, if you are not, especially if you're not a numbers person, please don't focus too heavily when you're reading this on learning the formulas and learning the numbers. I mean, if you even attempt to look at the appendix in some of these chapters, like myself included, I'm very much a qualitative researcher, so even I don't very much deal with statistics, can get lost in some of these numbers. So please, if you need to browse over and kind of jump over until you get to something that really makes sense to you, by all means go ahead and do that. I even tried to make sure I tailored the discussion questions in a way where you didn't need to know that type, that depth of information. But that being said, I think there's a lot of really good information here, and I think it's important that we focus on the primary terms, what they mean, and how to make sense of some of that. So let's go ahead and get started. As you can probably already hear, my dog is playing with her chew toy, so you might be hearing a little bit of that in the background. Okay, so in terms of statistics, oftentimes you use some of these numbers in everyday use to make sense of things that make the kind of with one simple number, we have an idea of the success or failure of somebody, right? So they use the example like a bowling score or a GPA, and by using those numbers, we can make a lot of inferences. Often, right? They use the example of like sampling and Gallup polls. I know there's a lot of hesitancy to trust polling, but that's a much deeper dive than we need to get into. But for the most part, they can be fairly accurate, right? They're only maybe interviewing 1,000 people, but from those thousands of people, they can kind of infer a number of beliefs and behaviors from that polling, right? Other things you can do with statistics, you can assess risk and other probability-related events. So if you think about casinos or insurance companies, whether you should be buying the warranty on a particular, whether it's like a printer or something along those lines. And then it can help identifying important relationships, right? So does smoking cause cancer, right? Is there a relationship between video games and violence? There's a number of ways, or a number of studies that get done to try to find these types of relationships. Now, in terms of specifically descriptive statistics, there are a couple questions that they talk about, right? Like what is happening to the economic health of America's middle class? Who is the greatest baseball player of all time, right? They talk about batting averages. They talk a lot of other key numbers that people look at, whether it's the raise in middle class income or median income. A lot of different things that you can talk about, but overall, what I want you to remember when it comes to these descriptive statistics, the big takeaway from chapter 1 is that these numbers give us manageable and a meaningful summary of an underlying phenomenon. However, any simplification invites abuse. As you remember from the video that we saw at the beginning of semester 2 with John Oliver, it's very easy to manipulate some of these numbers. That being said, one thing that we're kind of jumping up a little bit here, but one of the next topics I want to cover when it comes to figuring out what these numbers really mean is when they started talking about the standard deviation, because I think that's really important, right? I think they use that example of the printer. They use the example of if you have a bunch of people on the plane and you have like the mean weight of like 155 pounds. They give a lot of different information, different examples of what a standard deviation means. But I think that's really helpful, because if someone were to come and show you that your company was the number of sales for a particular product dipped by 10 units per day or something along those lines, it's important to know what the standard deviation is for any given day. Right now, if it's a pattern, that's something you need to be aware of. But if it's from Monday to Friday, and Friday you see a little bit of a dip, if it's still within that standard deviation, then it's not something you need to panic over, because I think that's this is where we see some of the connections between these numbers and these statistics and leadership, right? Understanding that if you see a number and misconstrue that number, it can be really easy for you to jump and make some sort of rash decision based on a number you don't truly fully understand. So it's important to understand this deviation, the standard deviation. You can think about it like let's say you have a fever, right? Usually the normal body temperature is 98.6, but there's a standard deviation about a couple of degrees, right? Before people really start worrying whether you're actually sick or not. It could just be that you're in general, you're hot. It could be a number of things that could be affecting you to go a little bit lower, a little bit higher, but there is that standard deviation. I think they even used the example of the average American male height, right? So I think it's 5'10" plus or minus 3 inches, right? So anything between 5'7" and 6'1" is normal. It's within that standard deviation. So even whether you're a couple inches taller, a couple inches shorter, you're still within that standard deviation. And that's where some of these numbers, it's helpful to understand the context behind these numbers, right? Because the benefit as well as the risk when it comes to these descriptive statistics is that it does help in providing that summary of a lot of information into one number, but it doesn't really give you the true sense of what all the context is. So it's important that you ask these questions when you get numbers like that. Now, he talks about the difference between precision and accuracy. Precision reflects the exactitude with which we can express something. The accuracy, a measure of whether a figure is broadly consistent with the truth. And he gave that really good example of if someone's asking you where the nearest gas station is, and you say it's 1.62 miles east, but it's actually 1.62 miles west, the answer was very precise, but it wasn't very accurate. On the other hand, if you just say, well, if you go down this way, and then right when you hit the Circle K, make a right and then make another left, and if you hit this street, you've gone too far. It's not very precise, but it's much more accurate. Again, things you have to consider when you're getting these descriptive statistics, understanding the difference between precision and accuracy. So some examples, right? So we have politician A, right? And this is where we start getting into the idea of deceptive descriptions, right? So politician A is a challenger. Our schools are getting worse. 60% of our schools had lower test scores this year than last year. And politician B, or the incumbent, our schools are getting better. 80% of our students had higher test scores this year than last year. Now, when it comes to these numbers or something, again, context is really important. And numbers and what numbers people are looking at is really important, right? So in this example, politician A, who's a challenger, he's using schools as a unit of analysis. Politician B is using students as a unit of analysis, right? So there's a chance that there are fewer schools that are doing well, but there's also clearly what the numbers are showing that more students are succeeding, right? So these are, again, important ways that we should look at this information to make sure that people aren't using these numbers to deceive. And there's an example I'd like to give, not personal example, but one that's really relevant to me, and I always have fun with this. So as I mentioned in the last lecture, I'm really big into fantasy football, and I'm not going to jump real quick into a big description of fantasy football, but for those who don't know what it is, if you have any idea how football goes, all fantasy does is you build a team from players from all different teams, and essentially how well your player succeeds on the field, they do well on your fantasy team, right? So if they run for 10 yards, they get a point. If they score a rushing touchdown, they get 6 points. The points differ from league to league, and I won't get into the nitty-gritty, but it is really important to know which players you think are going to do well, which players you don't think are going to do well. A player who's maybe lower ranked, you think is going to do better. All of these things, really big on numbers. Even though I'm not a numbers person, it's very centered on numbers. This analyst, Matthew Berry, he does a list every year of 100 facts you need to know before the season starts. And he goes through this exercise, and I want to run through it for you, right? So again, even if you don't understand numbers, I think you'll get this example. So he says, which player do you want? Running back A is an absolute fantasy football scoring machine. The second best running back in the NFL in rushes per touchdown. His 12 rushing touchdowns in his final 9 games last season led the NFL during that span, and he was second in rushing yards, scoring more fantasy points than even Christian McCaffrey, who was one of the highest scoring running backs. A big play waiting to happen, he led all running backs of a minimum of 100 carries and percentage of rushes that went for 5+ yards and 10+ yards last season. He ran behind a great offensive line. He was second among our running backs in yards per rush before first contact, and he was tough to bring down when you finally got to him. He was top 10 among running backs in yards per rush after first contact. He is a starting running back on one of the best running teams in the NFL, a squad that is top 5 in the league in both rush percentages and red zone rush percentage, so it's exciting to think about how much he'll get fed since he was 4th best among running backs in fantasy points per touch. Running back A is sure to be a centerpiece on many fantasy championship teams this season. Now, running back B was 3rd on his own team last season in red zone carries and is more of a career special teams player than fantasy asset at running back. At best a situational player, he had only 3 games last season with more than 12 touches, and in 16 games last season, he had just 6 goal-to-go carries compared to 21 for other running backs on his team, showing that his team has had a lack of faith in him near the goal line. That's where players will score the touchdowns. Speaking of those other running backs, our guy is on the wrong side of a committee situation, as there were 2 other running backs on his team last season who averaged more carries per game and 3 other running backs on his team who had more receptions. And that's despite the fact that running back B was the only running back on his team to play all 16 games last season. He was non-existent in the passing game and is now 28 years old. His own team wouldn't even commit to him on the field last season, so why should you? So Matthew Berry asks, so which player do you want? Understand that every single stat I mentioned above about each player is 100% true. Which player do you want? They are going in the same round in ESPN leagues. Which player do you want? You just read about 400 words about 2 players, so I would expect you to have at least a leaning towards one of those other guys, of one of these guys over the other. So before you answer, you should know one more fact about each guy. Running back A is Raheem Mostert. Oh, and I should also mention this. Running back B's name is also Raheem Mostert. So it is very easy, as you can tell from this example, that you can get all these numbers and play with them and use them however you want. We see it similarly in the example that they gave in the book with Verizon and AT&T, right? They both have this number of how much coverage they have, but they're using different terms, they're using different numbers. One, Verizon is talking about coverage, right? We have all this land mass that we're covering, and AT&T is like, no, we cover more Americans, right? Because it's great that if you're ever stuck in the middle of nowhere that you have coverage, but you're more often than not going to be there. There's going to be exceptions to that, but for the most part, where most people are making phone calls, we got you covered, right? But they have to figure out a way to advertise and make sense of these things and lure people to their company, to their wireless plan, right? But again, I think that's a big thing. The big takeaway from this first part of Wheelin' is the fact that these numbers can be incredibly useful, right? It is time consuming if you are having to kind of scour through all this information and all these numbers. You might just not have the time for that. So these simplified descriptive statistics can be really helpful, but it's also important that you're careful and that you understand the context behind these numbers and understand the terminology that's being used when discussing these numbers. So, and I'm going to end it with this quote that I think was really good. The fact that you've calculated the mean correctly will not alter the fact that the median is a more accurate indicator. Judgment and integrity turn out to be surprisingly important. A detailed knowledge of statistics does not deter wrongdoing any more than a detailed knowledge of the law averts criminal behavior. With both statistics and crime, the bad guys often know exactly what they're doing. So, want to reiterate just one more time as we continue on through this book, do not get lost in the weeds. I try to pick the right chapters that I think really would be helpful and beneficial to you all. I try to choose discussion board questions that I think would really pull out the important aspects that I want you to focus on, and I'm going to be using these lectures to really hone in on the main ideas that I think are important. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, drop on my office hours, and figure out some time that we can talk.